All right, we're live. Welcome everybody to another CanJS Widgetry. This is number 5. We're going to be building a rich text editor. I gave this presentation yesterday at CanJS Chicago, and I think it went really well. This is a very interesting topic, dealing with a text editor and text ranges and things like that. It's something I've only had to deal with maybe a handful of times in my career as a JavaScript developer. But once you're in there, it's like a whole different ecosystem and realm of the browser APIs. And it can be really challenging if you ever have to do special stuff with text selection. It's a very kind of unnatural compared to the rest of the DOM. So my hope is that by going through this, if you are encountering rich functionality, the designer's like, hey, we want a copy to CSV functionality, which is actually a common request that I've seen. People want to click a button and download all of the copy to the clipboard, so they can play in Excel some of the data that they're visualizing. If a designer wants that, requests that, you're gonna be like, oh, sure, no problem. I can do it in a few hours instead of a few days. So without further ado, let's begin. Oh, and thanks, Matthew, for joining me. I think he's got a Cubs shirt on.
I do, yeah.
That's pretty
Going to spring training next week.
Heck yeah. Where is their spring training?
It's in Phoenix.
So you're going?
Yeah.
Sweet.
My family's huge, or my wife's family, actually. I'm a bandwagon.
You're a bandwagon?
Yeah.
I've jumped off the bandwagon when everybody else jumped on for some strange reason. I don't know why I did that. Right as they became good, I was like, I'm done with baseball. And I didn't have the energy to climb back aboard.
Yeah.
All right, so let's see what we'll be building here. So this is a very simple text editor. I can delete and type stuff, and I can highlight things, and I can bold it. I can make it italic. I can copy all, with the click of this button, I can copy all content to the clipboard. If I have Atom open, I could paste it, the contents. And the final thing is I have this funky button where I can select text and it will make that text funky. And I can select all text or text across different elements and it'll also work making it funky. And that's actually the really hard part of this exercise, will be making that final step work. Some of this stuff, let me rerun my widget here. Some of the stuff is actually like being able to type and delete and even highlight text and do Command B for it to bold. Some of that stuff will just come for free because of content editable, but the buttons up here are really the stuff that we're going to be focusing on and building today. So let's start with the basic application setup. Now, I'll go through the guide. The recipe starts with CanJS already installed. It also has a few helpers that I'll get to later that I didn't want people to have to figure out how to implement on their own because it would just take a lot to get them to implement, and a few other helpers that I encourage that people will implement as going through part of the guide. The first step, though, is we want to simply I just want to get a text area that I can start typing in. And I'm not going to worry about any of these controls. I just want to, what I really want to be able to do is if someone wants a rich text editor, I want them to just be able to put in their page or in another components view, rich text editor. To make a custom element. Hey, there's a rich text editor. And as long as they've loaded the CanJS code and that we're going to be making, a rich text editor will just magically appear. Now, this is where CanJS 4.0 starts to make things a lot easier. you can just simply extend CanComponent with the name of the element that you want to define the functionality for. So in this case, rich text editor. And believe it or not, at this point, there's actually like a component installed and instantiated on this element. Of course, it's not doing anything yet because we haven't added a view or any view model code to make it do anything. So that's what I'm going to change next. I'm going to make a view, and for now, I'm just going to say hello world, just to make sure I got stuff working. So now, whenever we say rich text editor, it's going to say actually rich text editor lives. So now if someone just were to put a rich text editor in the page, you know, they could put multiple of them and they will just see this rich text editor lives over and over and over again. So that's new in CanJS 4.0. So really what we want to do is start with a, if you're trying to make a rich text editor, the easiest way to do that is with the content editable attribute. And I'll talk about content editable, but let me create one real quick. So I'm going to make a div that is going to have its content editable attribute set to true. And I'm going to give it a class name that will add some styles to make it kind of obvious where it is. So with just this, you kind of have the start of a rich text area that browsers will provide. I do think that most, I would say, professional rich text editors don't actually use content editable too much. That's because of browser quirks. They tend to do everything that content editable does for you by themselves. And I'm not 100% familiar with anymore how far content editable has gotten in terms of its standards, what it provides. But for the most part, at least in checking in between Firefox, Safari, and Chrome, it seems like everything is pretty similar now. So I'm guessing for basic applications, basic use cases, content editable is going to be everything you need. And what content editable provides is any content that you start with in here. I'm going to add some default content real quick so we can just start with something. Let's say that I had some content inside here. I've got this OL. Some things we're going to learn about. Another div. Any content inside here is immediately editable, right? I can hit enter and I can type stuff. I can delete stuff. I can even copy and paste stuff. I can Command B to make it bold. I can Control Z. You get a ton of functionality for free.
Like it creates LIs for you.
It does when you hit enter. Yeah. To do everything that content editable does on your own would be a massive undertaking. And that's why it's really, really useful as long as hopefully every browser that you support supports everything that you need it to support. So that's a great start. We've basically started the application right now. I'm going to add one more thing, just a title above this because we're going to need this later. I'm just going to call this app composer. We need a little bit of text outside of our text editor to demonstrate some problems that will occur with it in the future. So there, we've pretty much bootstrapped a little rich text editor. In a real application, of course, you'd want your HTML that's inside of here to be able to be pasted or passed as a property to the view model. But in this case, I'm just putting it in here, and we're not really making this, accept and be able to save text. You can figure that on your own. I really want to focus more on the range APIs and things like that. So the next step I want to do is add the bold button, right? So if I select some text, I hit bold, that text becomes bold. To add a bold button, I'm going to create a button for it. I'm going to keep my buttons in a controls div. So I'm going to have a class of controls. This is where all of my buttons will go. So on click is how you listen with CanJS to a button being clicked. I'm going to call this B for bold, and I'm going to give it a class name of bold. So it actually looks bold, so people know what it does, of course. And the so this in CanJS is how you listen to a button being clicked. You do this on : click, and then you can run functions here. Now these functions are limited to scope in within the components view model. So I don't have a view model yet, but I do want to call a function. I'm going to start with, for now, a bold function. I'm going to have a bold function here. I can call the bold function like this. And this is a feature of the browser and of editable areas. If you've selected something in an editable area, like I've done over here, you have a range that is selected, you can call this execute command function of the document, and it will essentially bold. It'll change any of the HTML here, so it's wrapped with bolds. So if I do document.exec is an execute command. It's like a shorthand writing, which is weird for the DOM. And I could do bold and then false, false. These are other arguments. Don't really worry about what those do for right now. So now if I hit this bold, if I select some text and I hit bold, it bolds. I can go across multiple elements, hit bold, and it bolds. Cool. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is make an italic button. So that's going to really just do the same thing. This is really easy once you understand how to do bold. But I'm going to make it so that bold and italic use the same function. So I don't have to make another italic function here because that can get repetitive. So I'm going to make an executable function here, and I'm going to pass it bold, or I'm going to pass it italic. And then I'm going to make this execute function take which command to run and pass that to here. Pass that to this execute command function. Oh, I want to change this to I and italic. Now I should be able to make things italic and make things bold. All right, fairly straightforward. Now, if you look at document execute command, there is a whole bunch of commands that you can run there that do stuff to your selection. I'm not going to go through those, but you could basically think of it as if the user selected something, the execute commands will do something to essentially the HTML that they've selected. We'll later use it to add copy. Actually, I think that's the next step. We'll add it to make a CopyAll button. We'll use that to make a CopyAll button. So that's what I'm going to do. Now is I want to make a CopyAll button. Let me get my show what that looks like with the.
Hey, just I have a very quick question. When you do the execute command bold italic, does it actually modify the DOM elements?
Yes, that's a really good question. It totally does. So like here, let's just do this, and I do bold.
So you can control it with CSS that way.
It will add a B tag. Yeah.
Cool.
So you can see here, like it cut off the EA, and then from the RN and learn, and added a bold around that. And then because I did partway and celebrate, it should have Cella and then Brate as a text node after that. So yeah, it's kind of smart enough to like walk through all of the nodes and wrap them with bold in the right way. Okay, so the next thing is this CopyAll. We already saw that, but I'll do it again. What this is going to do overall When you hit this button, it's going to create a range that is the contents of this editable area, the edit box. And then it's going to add that range to what's selected. We'll probably cover this a little bit more, but there's a difference between ranges and what is selected. Like I can create a kind of a range of elements, like kind of, you know, I could create a range that goes from the contents of this LI to the next LI. But that is not the selected range until I make that range the selected range. So you can have like lots of ranges that aren't going to like show up as blue highlighting, but then you can make a range. What the user actually sees is what's being highlighted by making it the selected range. So what the copy all button does is essentially it's going to make a range that covers the entire contents of the edit box. Then it is going to make that like the official selected range for the browser, so that actually shows up as blue selected text. And then it's going to run the document execute command copy, which has the effect of actually copying what's in the selection to the clipboard. I actually did this with Keynote. It even copies. It actually copies it as HTML, so that if you have something that accepts HTML, I was actually. Let me see if I can pop this open and show this real quick. And it'll be really small. If I just paste that in again, see, it got the. It did get the bolding and the. It gets the bolding and the italics, right, and the ordered list, right? So it's actually copying your HTML content, and if an application can receive that, it'll work with that, which is really, really nice. Okay, so let's make that work. First thing I'm going to do is kind of similar pattern that we did before. I'm going to make a copy all button. I'm going to call a copy all method on the view model. Then I'm going to make the method. Now, like I said, the first thing that we need to do is be able to get the edit box element. We need to somehow get this element inside this function. Now, by default, view models don't have access to the element. That's to prevent people from mostly doing things they shouldn't be doing. Like your view model shouldn't be updating the DOM directly, right? That's not a very good practice most of the time, because most of the time your view should be doing that. But there are some things like ranges that, well, you know, the stash just doesn't provide able to control ranges through it. It doesn't, you can't articulate where ranges should be in stash. So you have to actually get the element. To get the element of the rich text editor element so that we can get its edit box element, I'm going to use the new in 4.0 connected callback hook. So this gets called when the view model is essentially like when the rich text editor becomes alive and is in the page, the view model's connected callback will get called back with the element, with the rich text editor element, and I want to save that element. Now for this, because this is a defined map and you have to define all of your properties, your stateful properties ahead of time, I need to make sure my element property is defined. And I'm going to say the element can be set, property can be set to any value. Don't try any type coercion. Just take whatever you get passed. I guess if I was being really fancy, I could set this to like HTML element, and that would probably work. But I just go with any. No, then it doesn't have to do any type checking. Anyways, so now that I have access to my element, I can access it like this. When copy all gets called, it will have the element, and I can use query selector to get the edit box. Matthew, I don't know. I think there's some questions in the YouTube chat. if you can check that out for me and let me know if there's things that I should be answering.
Yep.
And be careful when you view that page because you will hear an echo if you don't mute it.
Gotcha.
Okay, so I can get the edit box, and I need to select all of the content. I need to create a range that selects all of the contents of the edit box. So first, I'm going to save the edit box. Then what I'm going to make is a range that will eventually select the contents of the edit box. I'm going to call that edit box range. And to create your own range, well, let's create range. Now, the way to think about a range, again, is it's like it's almost like pointers towards parts of the DOM that has a beginning and an end. It can point to like a node. It can point to two different, like you can have a start of a range points to one node and end of a range points to another node. You can also have ranges point within text nodes. You can say like, well, if the range starts at the second letter of the learn text box of this learn text and ends at like the fourth letter. You could say that is a range. And again, ranges are not necessarily what is highlighted. They're just kind of essentially pointers to two DOM nodes, a start and an end. So this creates a range that really doesn't have a start and an end at this point, but we're going to give it one. And the ranges have a useful helper called select node contents. And this will select the contents of an element. So in this case, I want it to select the edit box. Now, if I hit this button, you'll see nothing happens. Because again, even though we made a range select the node contents, we didn't make that the like official range of what should be shown, the selection, essentially. To make that the selection, I have to first get the selection object. So you can do that with this window get selection. And this gives you the selection API, which you can remove and add ranges to, and those are what show up as what's selected. Now, because I want what we're going to copy to be the only range, like I'm going to add a range, and I want that to be the only thing that we copy. Putting it another way, selections can have multiple, what's selected can actually have multiple ranges that are discontinuous. We don't want that. We want it to be just one range. So I need to remove any other possible ranges that might have been selected when they hit the copy all button. We want to remove all of those, right? So you can see how that's gone when I hit the copy all button. I think it would have gone away anyways, but this just makes sure that nothing else is being selected there. And then the final step is I want to make it so the selection, the official selection of what's shown to the user includes the edit box range. So I'm going to call add range, edit box range. Now with that, we've made a range that selects the entire node contents, and then we've essentially made that range part of the official selected. So now the browser is actually going to show it as being selected. And because this is what's part of the selection, document execute command is affected by it, right? So if I ran bold here, this would essentially make everything bold. CopyAll made everything bold, but I don't want to do that. Instead, what I want to do is copy everything. This doesn't take any arguments. So now when I hit the copy all button, hooray, I should just be able to go and paste. I'm basically pasting the same thing, but it works. We can prove that it works. Stuff. Hooray.
So what does select node contents do?
Select node contents. That moves the range start and end to the contents of the element that you passed it.
Okay.
So for instance, because we pass it this edit box, you could think of it as it starts the range right here and then ends the range right here.
Okay.
It'll start it at like this text node right here, and then it'll end it at the end of this text node right here.
Why do we want to do that?
Well, what if someone, it's possible there's text right here. You want to copy that too?
We only want, oh, you're copying all. Okay, yeah.
Copy all, yeah. Not what someone selected. We're copying everything.
Okay. I was looking at the chat. Someone asked a question. If you have a moment to talk about this, a user asks, how would you? He wants to save the content of the content editable so that when the next time the user loads the browser or goes to a different view, that they're able to show the same content later. How might you implement that?
So there's a few different tricks. Probably the one that I would probably go to first would be to use you can listen to. There's a few different ways you can do it. One is just like on every single change that the person might make. So you can listen to like key up, or you can listen to different events to like know when this HTML has changed. I would just be saving it to like local storage or something like that. So one way of doing it would just be to, I could do on key up, save, and then save could essentially do the same similar kind of thing it was doing here. I would get the edit box, and then I would in local storage, what is it to save something in local storage? Is it just set? But it's not set. It's something else.
Well, there is that way, or you can just set a key.
Yeah, there's set key though, right?
Yeah, but you don't have to do that. So I think it's set item, but
item. I would just do like last or something, and then just be essentially the HTML of this, and I could look for that when in the connected callback here, once the element was inserted in the page, I would essentially update this with what was in local storage. Hopefully that gives someone an idea about how to do it. It's a good question, though. Thanks for asking. All right. So actually, well, there are some other. I've done this once before, and I do think that only doing it on key up is kind of a problem because, again, people can change things with these buttons. What might actually be a better way of doing it instead of key up would actually be to use mutation observers to listen to any HTML changes in this content and then do the save on that. That's actually probably a more robust way of doing it than listening to key up. That was a good last minute pro tip, I think. All right. Let's go to the funky button, shall we? So the funky button, what we're going to do right now is we're going to make it so when you select we're not going to make it so you can select across nodes, but if you just select the text in a single node and hit funky, we're going to make that work. It's also going to have a bug, which isn't present in the final solution, where if you selected a text outside of the text area and click funky, it would also make that funky. But we're going to fix that after we just make it work a little bit. And the method, how we're going to do this is essentially when someone hits the funky button, it's going to call a method. That's going to get the current range. And there's a way to wrap a range that's only in a text node with an element. So we're going to wrap it with an element, a span that has the class funky. So there's some things that are useful to know before we get into this, and I'll talk about them here.
And this is very similar to what the browser's doing with like bold and italics.
Yes, it wraps it with a bold, but the way that we're going to be doing it, it won't be able to work. The browser, the execute command can work across multiple elements. Ours will not be working across multiple elements. But a few things to understand before we start getting into this, because now things are going to get progressively harder. The first thing is to understand that text nodes exist. This UL actually has 7 children, not 3, because there's text nodes here, there's a text node here, there's a text node here, and there's a text node here. So the UL's children actually looks like this. Text nodes are things that exist that people sometimes forget about. And what we're going to essentially be doing is if a user selected about selection and learning about selection ranges, if they did this, we're going to be converting it to, we're going to be wrapping that with a span that has the class name funky. So let's do that. Again, we're going to start with the funky button. And if I give this one a class name of funky, you can see it has this funky color change style applied to it. If you want to see how that's done, you can look in the CSS. It's mostly a CSS animation that just keeps looping every 150 milliseconds. And I just have keyframes that go between all the colors of the rainbow. Is this my working version? Okay, it's not. I was about to like, it's hard to start. It's gonna be hard for me to tell the final version now, just on visuals alone from our working version. Okay, we're still in the working version though. So I'm gonna implement the funky. And funky needs to, just like copy, it needs to, well, actually, it doesn't need to do that right now. Right now, all it needs to do is get the selected range, what the users have actually selected. And then it's going to wrap that with a span. So I'm going to do a similar kind of thing to what we did before. I'm going to get the selection object because this has the ranges inside of it. I want to make sure something is actually selected, like if it actually has a range inside of it, because maybe the user hasn't selected anything. And if they hit funky, we don't want to do that. So if there is a selection, because you might not have had an actual like selected, it's possible to have not. I didn't dig into this too much, but it's possible to not have a selection. It's also possible to have a selection object that doesn't have ranges, but has like other things in it. So that's why there's like a range count, but you also need to check for selection. I don't know what they're planning. What situation where you don't have ranges, but you still have a selection. Future devices that a browser can run in, I'm not sure, but this is why you do it like that. This is at least the recommended approach. And then once you have that, you can get the selected range. So this is now, I know where the users, it will give me a range. So if I selected about selection, if that's what's highlighted, selected range is essentially going to say it starts with the text node at like maybe 7th character and ends at maybe about like the 18th, 19th, something like that. I'm not exactly sure where this is. All right, so that's what that selected range is going to report. Now, if I want to wrap this with a span, I'm first going to create my span. Then I'm going to take the range, selected range, and I'm going to wrap that, or it's called surround contents. I'm going to surround it with this span. And then finally, I'm going to give that span a class name of funky. And now I should be able to get funky. Boom. And if we look at the DOM here, we have that span is wrapping that range that was selected. Now, we have a bug right now. where if I try to select something outside of the text area for the edit box, we can make those things funky. That's not probably what you want, although someone said it's a feature when I showed this last night, which maybe it's a fun feature at least. It's like an Easter egg, I guess. And the other problem is if we select across multiple elements, and this is, we're going to get to this after we fix the doing it out of bounds. After we do that, we're going to fix the problem where if you select across different text nodes and hit funky, you'll see the browser throws an error because you've tried to call surround contents on a range that has things other than a single text node. It doesn't like that. So we have to fix that problem.
So surround contents is always just for text nodes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So before we start solving this problem up here, actually, I'm gonna move some code of this code into a helper. This get elements in range, all I want it to do, is go from the beginning of the range to the end of the range and call back with every element that should be essentially decorated with funky, and should essentially it's going to call back with the wrapped elements. So instead of all of this, what I really want to do is just call, and it's going to return all of those elements that should be wrapped. So what I really want to be able to do is call get elements in range with my selected range and say, hey, I want to wrap anything you need to wrap it with a span. And now this is going to return a bunch of elements, like wrapped elements, or things really you should decorate. Call elements to decorate. It's gonna kind of go from the beginning of the range to the end of the range eventually, and return all of the elements that should be decorated. And then with the elements to decorate, I just want to be able to loop through them all and then decorate them however I want them to. And this could be a nice helper so I could do things other than funky. I can just use this helper and it wraps all the elements, and then I can kind of add whatever other class name or do whatever changes I want to them. So in this case, I'm gonna get my element and I'm gonna add funky to it. I'm just kind of rewriting the code here to prepare for future challenges. So that means to implement get elements in range right now, it's going to create a wrapper element, take the range, surround it with that wrapper, and then it's going to return the wrapper as an array of items. Because in the future, we're going to have multiple items that this can return. Okay, so with that, it should still work. It works. Now we're starting to be in a better position to solve the next problem, which is that this gets funkified, but should not be funky. So to fix this, what we really want to do is see the current selection. Here, let me run this again. I want to compare the current selection to a range that is all of the contents of the edit box and see, is this range, that's the current selection range, inside the contents of the edit box. So the browser actually provides ways of comparing ranges. So we'll essentially create a range again, like we did in copy, for all of the content in the edit box, and we'll just compare that to the range of what's being selected. So really in funky here, what I need is that edit box range again. So I'm just going to copy this code up here so I can get that edit box range. And then with the edit box range, I want to see, this edit box range. With this edit box range, I want to see, does this contain the selected range? And that's what this RangeContains helper is going to do for us. I'm going to use it before I implement it. So what I want to see is if the EditBox range is contained. So if range contains, the EditBox range contains the selected range, then we're going to go do this business of getting the elements to decorate, and then decorating them the way we want to.
Hey, quick question. Calling select node contents, that doesn't actually select it like visually, right?
No, again, that's you're absolutely right. That's when I keep saying there's like a difference between the ranges that are in the selection object and just ranges in general. Mm-hmm. That's that distinction. You can create ranges. It doesn't actually select them until those ranges are added to the selection like they were up here.
Okay. But when you do that, actually will visually show it. Okay.
And then document execute command only operates on the ranges within the selection object. It's like you can create these little things. They aren't really part of any global state, if you will. Selection is that global state that like makes it so it actually is highlighted, makes it so document execute command operates on that. Otherwise, ranges are like, you can almost think of them as like document fragments or, you know, just nodes that are not actually attached to the DOM. They're just like references and, you know, they don't really, there's no visual aspect to them until you make them part of the selection. Okay, so now we need to implement this RangeContains. And again, we're going to make it so that if the edit box, we're basically seeing, does the edit box range that we created contain what the user selected? And if it does, then we're going to do all the mutations. So I need to implement this RangeContains. Now, the browser provides this way of doing comparison. So it looks something like this. You can do outer, you can do a range dot compare boundary points, and then you can pass in how to do the comparison, and then with what you're doing the comparison. How set, because ranges, a range has a beginning and an end. So maybe I want to compare the beginning of outer to the beginning of inner, and the end of outer to the end of inner. That's essentially what I want to do here. I want to make sure that like the start of outer is before the start of inner. To do that, you can use these range start to start. That says I want to compare the start of outer to the start of inner. And this will be either -1 if outer is before inner, 0 if they're the same, or 1 if outer is after inner. I want to make sure outer is before or equal to inner, so I'm going to make it less than or equal to 0. So if the start of outer is before or equal to inner, we're checking that. And then we also want to check, I'm gonna copy and paste this part. We also want to check that the outer is after or equal to, the outer's end is after or equal to the inner's end. So now we have our range comparison function. It should work. So now when I do this, do funky, it doesn't work. If I do this and funky, it does work.
Could you kind of do this with using contains as well?
Yes, you could. You would have to, given the range that was selected, you would probably, we'll see there's an ancestor, ranges you can get common ancestor, and using that you could use contains. I actually implemented contains before, like what the old polyfill for contains was actually using ranges. believe it or not.
The other thing is, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think if you were to select composer and drag it into also select stuff that's inside, it wouldn't work, right?
Drag this?
Like, or can you not do that? Maybe can you not pull it up and also select composer? No.
What do you mean by pull it?
Start selecting inside of the content editable, and then try to get it to also go up to. No, it doesn't do that.
It won't let you drag selected text.
You can't. That's what I was thinking. If that was possible, then this would not.
Yeah.
Wouldn't work.
Cool. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the hardest part, and this is where things get funky, but not in like the cool like what is the George Clinton kind of way, but the funky, it kind of smells way. And if people aren't as old as me and don't know who George Clinton is, I don't mean the president. I mean like the grandmaster of funk, George Clinton. Anywho, so now we want to make it so if I select all of this text, it's going to, if I hit funky, it's going to work. And like I said, this is really hard, and there's some things that we're going to have to talk about to make it so we can make this work. Feel free to read this algorithm that I wrote out for how to do this. This algorithm really is, in some ways, the bedrock of how a lot of text editors need to work. But I think it's easier if you just I talk about it with examples. So let's say I've selected from right after the A, B, and about to right after Sella and Celebrate. So the user has selected this, and I've marked where they've kind of started and ended with these vertical bars. How do we make it so that like this out becomes funky, CanJS becomes funky, this whole LI becomes funky, this LI becomes funky, this LI becomes funky, this div becomes funky, and this little part here becomes funky. But we don't want, like, for example, this whole LI to become funky, because then it would start highlighting learn and also AB, and the whole OL can't be funky. Well, essentially what you do, generically the algorithm you could think about it is, you kind of want to find your like, ranges provide their common ancestor. And the div that would wrap both of these would be the common ancestor of the start and end of the range, right? So the common ancestor is like, I know where I'm beginning, I know where I'm ending. Which element contains both the start and the end? Well, it'd be the parent of the kind of all of these things. In this case, it would be the edit box. What you want to do is find kind of the first element that of the container of the common ancestor that contains the start of the range and the kind of first child node of the common ancestor that contains the end of the range. And then you want to make sure that everything between is going to be funkified. So we'll add funky to this div. And so let's just talk about how we find this element and then how we kind of like fill everything out. This element and this element. This is really tricky and hard to explain, but I'm gonna do my best. So the general pattern is from where you start, you're gonna go to your next siblings and then walk to the parent. Don't funkify the parent, but you're gonna go to your next siblings and funkify everything there. And then you're gonna go to that parent and then not funkify it, but funkify all next siblings, and then go to the parent and keep doing that and repeating until you get to a parent that is a direct descendant of the common ancestor, and then stop. And then you're going to do the same thing, but kind of in reverse. From the end of your node, you're going to say, okay, I'm going to funkify Sella, and I'm going to go to the previous siblings. Well, there aren't any. I'm going to go to the div. That's a direct descendant. I'm going to stop and node my end line. So it's like the OL is the start kind of the starting line, if you think. The div is the ending line, and then you're just going to highlight, you're going to funkify everything in between as well. So let's see how this plays out. So I would funkify the out by wrapping that in a span, and then I would go up to its parent, which is the B, and then I would start moving to the right, next sibling, and start funkifying all next siblings. In this case, it's CanJS. The CanJS would be wrapped with a span. Then we would run out of siblings. We would then go up to the parent LI and start going to its siblings and funkifying them. Now, we will ignore any text nodes that don't have any content, because there's no reason to wrap this with like a span. You wouldn't want to anyways, and call it funky. So we just ignore text nodes that are empty. Then we're going to do all siblings once we get to the LI. So all these LIs would be made funky. Then we would get to the parent OL and say, oh, hey, you're direct descendant of the shared common ancestor. We're going to stop, because we kind of mark that as our starting line. Then we do the same thing in reverse, wrapping Sella with funky, and then moving to its previous siblings, which there are none, and then walking up to its parent, seeing that, oh, you're a child of the common ancestor, you're the end line. And then finally we would go in between the kind of the OL and the div, the starting and ending line, and every kind of element in between there we would make funky. So yeah, that's the general algorithm. Now I'm gonna show how to write it. So
it's like 3 steps, right? You walk up to the starting line's common ancestor, then you do the same thing for the ending line, and then everything in between.
Right. Yeah. So this is kind of tricky. So the first thing that, well, let's kind of build it up incrementally a little bit. One second here. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do is, none of this should change up here anymore. Everything should just change and get elements in a range. Given a range, it should be returning all of the elements that should eventually have become funky, right? So it's either going to wrap text nodes or just return like those LIs and those divs or whatever that needs to be just made funky. That needs to be returned here. So really the first thing I'm going to do is make a little change here, which is I'm going to make this elements container, and I'm going to keep it working right now. I would just say like elements.push. I'm going to push in the wrapper, and I'm going to always return elements. Okay, so this is right here the case where like you've selected totally within a text node. So I'm going to handle that case separately, because that's really the easy case, and it doesn't really fit in with this other algorithm anyways. So to do that, what you can actually just check is the common ancestor of the range. So I'm going to get the common ancestor of the range, and then I'm also going to get the starting and ending nodes, like nodes of the range, and that's the range start container is the starting node. The end container is the ending node. And really, if your start container is in the same place, is equal to your common ancestor, well, that means you've selected a text node and you can do this code. So I'm just going to put some check here. It says, hey, if the start container is equal to the common ancestor, well, then we can use this shortcut method that the DOM provides us. We're just going to wrap it, the span, and return that span. Okay, we've handled that case. But now we've got to handle like the much more difficult case. So ranges really, when your user selects ranges, they almost always start in a text node. So you can pretty much rely on splitting. What you want to do is almost always wrap with wherever they've started the selection. So I'm going to call a helper function, which we'll see what it does, that given a range, it's just going to take the beginning of the range and the text node and split it. I'll explain what I mean by this. So,
sorry, is start container going to be a text node?
yes, and so end container. Because you select text, right? So it lands in a text node. It is possible that you like started here or something like that, but it would still give you a text node, and we would just create a little. I'm doing it not perfectly. Like it would create, like if you started right here, it would create a little empty span right here, and then start the algorithm.
I was thrown off by the name start container, which I don't understand why it's not like start node. It's
yeah, I don't know. That's good. That's a good point. It should be like start node. Okay, so this range split range start, what that's going to do is, let's say I selected I selected a small like this. That was my my selection. What split range start will do is take a range, essentially whatever the range starts with, that text, it's going to take that part of the text node that it's in and wrap it with whatever you pass here. So essentially, it's going to put a span like this. And split range end, which we'll use in a moment, does the same thing. Let me show the implementation of split range start. Split range start here essentially is going to create an element, their wrapper element. It's going to set the content of that span, if you will, to the content of the kind of starting text node, that essentially it's splicing off the end of the starting text node. What I mean by that is like it's splicing off this A, right? The text range.start offset is the number of characters that you've started within a text node. So in this case, if we're up here, it'd be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're essentially taking everything after 5 and putting that in the span. And then what we do is we actually shorten the starting text node. We take everything before 5 and make that the new content of that original text node, and then we insert the span right after kind of the starting text node. So that's what we've done here. Is we've essentially, okay, we've got our starting span, right, with whatever content you've started with. It would be the n and the rn and space now is wrapped with a span, and now we can start our general algorithm on how to solve this. Just a second here. So the next thing we need to do is start moving till the end line, that kind of weird walking algorithm. And there's another helper that does this. Oh, I'm using the wrong one. And this is the sibling then parent until helper. What this says is, starting at start wrap, you're going to move in this direction. You're going to keep going its next sibling, next sibling, next sibling, until you reach an end. And then you're going to go up to a parent until that parent is a child of this common ancestor. And then anytime you find a node that really should be funkified, if you will, you're going to call this function, which in our case is going to take the element and add it to this elements array. It's going to do a little bit more than that. We're going to fill that out right now before I show what sibling then parent until does. what add sibling element will do to say, hey, did we get a text node sibling? If we did, and there's something other than spaces, we're going to wrap it. We're going to create a wrapper and insert that wrapper in its place and then push the wrapper into elements. Otherwise, if it was like an LI or something like that, well, we're just going to push that into elements. Okay, so really what we need to now see is, well, I'll give another second on that. Okay, hopefully people understand that. Again, this is just like, if it's a text node, we need to wrap it as long as there's some spaces. Then we just wrap it. Otherwise, if it's a normal node, we just push it into elements so that eventually can be made funky. Now, sibling then parent is supposed to call that callback every time it encounters a node that essentially should be made funky by that algorithm we talked about in the beginning. Here's the code for sibling until parent. Essentially, while the current node's parent isn't the container of the common ancestor, if we can move in the direction next sibling, then move in the direction next sibling and call the callback. Otherwise, if there is no next sibling, move up to the parent. So this is actually relatively simple. It's just recursive. And then finally, what it does do is it returns the final parent that is the direct descendant of the common ancestor. So that's start line. Okay, so the final thing we need to do is, well, now we just need to get our end line, or we need to get our end wrapping element, like our kind of do the process in reverse. So first we get like our kind of starting span. That is the span that's kind of, you could think of as wrapping get fun, and then we are going to, once we have that, we're just going to do that same kind of walking process to find our end line in reverse with previous sibling. And then once we've done that, we just need to go from the start line to the end line and make sure that every line is added to the collection. Kind of everything between start and end line, or all of those kind of siblings in between those two places are added to the list of elements. And then we are mostly done. There's still two other problems, which we'll see, but we should be able to see a little bit of funkiness going on here. So if I go like this and hit funky, you'll see it didn't quite get it right. It didn't get, you'll see it got all of this, but it didn't get the R and N, and it didn't get like this get funky part. The reason is because the start wrap I forgot to add to the list of elements. So I can do that with this.
Sorry, what's the problem now?
The problem is, so here, look at, I selected for after E.
Oh, yeah.
And I go into the F and I hit funky. It didn't actually select those.
Okay.
So all that is this span that we created when we kind of like wrapped this part, that kind of starting span, we didn't actually add to the list of elements.
So yeah, it's because that's the part between that and the first bold.
Yeah. So, and we didn't do it with the ending one as well. So that's just because, yeah, we did create a span there. We just didn't actually like add it. So now, if I do this again, now it's working. Now there's still one more problem.
What about the like the end line there? Is that something that you can fix? Like line 2, the fact that it goes, it's not just the
well, yeah, that's the algorithm that I made it so it selects the LI. If you wanted to make it so you would wrap the innards of the LI if you wanted it to do that, but just the algorithm that I had, I just wanted it to like do this kind of full width selection. You would just need to change the algorithm, how it does wrapping a little bit differently. But there is still one final problem, which is look what happens to our selection. Whoop, I hit the wrong button. There you go. notice how our selection, see how learn up here somehow became selected? Like our actual like existing text selection kind of got messed up. And that's because when you change like the DOM under that's the ranges are pointing to, you're kind of removing them or changing them. It's very likely that the selection can get all out of whack, your range. So what we need to finally do at the end is make sure, despite our changes to the DOM, the range, the original range is still kind of pointing in the right place. So instead of it pointing to a text node, I'm going to point it at the start of the span wrapper that I inserted, and the end is going to point at the end of the kind of span wrapper that I inserted. So finally, now we have a fully working text editor that can change funky, and we can do pretty much whatever we want now with ranges. That was a lot at the end there, huh? So that is it.